I'm from Nairobi, Kenya. I do work across 2 organizations that are dedicated to the proposition that there's a huge opportunity for Africa, and particularly rural Africa, to play a critical role in achieving the climate transition to a climate sustainable planet through what I call, or what we call, climate positive growth. That's the work of the Climate Action Platform Africa, an organization I helped found, as well as the work I do as an investor at Africa Climate Ventures. So, but without any further ado, let's dive into the topic of today. So, financing regeneration through climate smart, there's a mouthful here, but I think it all speaks to a topic that's got, I think, fairly wide-ranging views, right? There's a recognition that we need to bring our soils back to life and shift to regenerative methods, and that the miracle of the Green Revolution, and I will call it a miracle because it verifiably saved millions of lives in terms of boosting agricultural productivity, came at a tremendous cost to our ecology and to our sustainability. And that Green Revolution has also left behind a chunk of the world, which I feel particularly strongly about because I'm from there. Africa has not had the same boosts from chemically driven industrial agriculture that you've seen elsewhere in the world. And the question now is, how do we boost yields while recognizing that we want to avoid the impacts on biodiversity, on soil viability, and importantly on carbon emissions, agriculture being one of those critical building blocks of the climate debt that we find ourselves in. How do we avoid and ideally reverse those impacts? Now, 3 components of soil health. There's soil acidity, there's organic matter, there is, well, I'm just referring back to my original notes, right? There's a question around how do you get nutrients into the soil in a regenerative way? How do you manage soil acidity? And how do you adopt regenerative practices? And the reason I come back to soil acidity so much is so much of practices like fertilizer application are 2 steps forward, 1 step back as they impact underlying soil chemistry and soil pH, degrading yields. So it turns out some folks, there was a moment of excitement a few years ago that says, well, you've got these carbon markets, you've got soil organic carbon, we're gonna use that to drive this whole process. So carbon is the answer. On the other hand, an argument that says that might be a distraction. Some people may be uncomfortable with the carbon markets as a theme, and folks saying, well, the yield of carbon is not necessarily that big on a per land basis and so on. And the question is, how do we address, well, there was an optimism there, there's been a correction, but there's also some interesting underlying insights, such as the fact that shifting to smart regenerative practices is showing real benefits in yields. And what I hope you will hear from the panel, and we will dig into this in a moment, is that what we need to do is take a blended view that's focusing on the things that farmers care about, which is their yields, delivering them in ways that make sense to them, with practices that make sense to them, with products that make sense to them, and over time building a market that creates the right signals for a shift. So already a very long-winded introduction from myself. I will talk a lot less as we go forward, and I'll turn to you, Caroline, inviting you into the conversation. So at 1 Acre Fund, you're working with millions of farmers across Africa, helping them basically boost their yields as smallholders, right? And there's sorry, bear with me. There's a little bit of a challenge here, which is we want to shift farmers to a regenerative and sustainable approach, but the prime directive is to increase or improve farmer livelihoods. And sometimes that is viewed as being intention, right? You're sitting within the finance function at 1 Acre Fund. How are you striking that balance between where we want to go, which is a sustainable regenerative agricultural set of practices, and we need to speak to smallholders' bottom line?
Thank you so much for the question, and thank you all. I'm just honored to be here on this panel and representing 1 Acre Fund's work. So for those of you who may not be familiar with 1 Acre Fund, we are a nonprofit social enterprise directly serving millions of smallholder farmers across 9 different countries in Africa. We were founded 18 years ago with the sole mission to serve the most extreme poor staple crop farm families who are typically growing maize and beans, often for their family's own consumption. So the farmers that we serve are often disconnected from value chains, they are not well served by markets, and they are among the world's most vulnerable to climate change. So One Acre Fund operates a social enterprise delivering farm inputs, so things like seed, high quality seed and fertilizer, and we provide these inputs on credit with really flexible repayment. Alongside supportive services like training and crop insurance and also market facilitation. So through this service bundle, farmers are able to dramatically improve their yields, on average 40%. Our team is 8,000 staff members, almost entirely based in our countries of operation, with the exception of a handful, including myself, that is based here. So our staff, who are often based in rural areas, are much closer to farmers and their fields than I am on the finance team here in the US. But to prepare for this panel, I talked to a bunch of my colleagues just to hear from them about what they're seeing with farmers and on their fields. And one quote in particular really stood out to me, a quote from an agronomist at One Acre Fund who said, he works in Rwanda, he said, Rwanda's biggest export isn't coffee or tea, it's the soil nutrients washing down the river. And I thought that was a really visceral kind of image of what smallholder farmers are dealing with and the challenges that they're up against, particularly with soil health and as it relates to erosion. We think our clients may be losing between $50 to $60 worth of soil nutrients in soil erosion. So that's $50 to $60 worth of what they could put in the soil with nutrients from fertilizer, just washing away. It's it's their investments into the fertilizer, into compost, manure, and lime. When it gets washed away, and that's a dramatic value for the farmers that we serve. So preventing this loss and improving long-term soil health is a huge priority for One Acre Fund in order to serve both climate goals and livelihood goals. They're intertwined. So the kind of large way that we do this is through an agroforestry initiative. So a very large tree planting initiative. We know that planting trees alongside crops can have a huge impact on erosion, among a host of other benefits, fixing nitrogen, biodiversity, sequestering carbon. So our tree program is really a huge priority in terms of regeneration for us. We started the agroforestry program in 2012 in alignment with our goals for farmers to be able to have big harvests, healthy families, and rich soils. And so our tree planting initiative is community-led. Farmers choose which trees to plant, and they plant them directly on their fields. And we've been able to plant, so far, 250 million trees. We planted our 250 millionth this year, and expect to plant 1 billion by 2030.
Bravo. Full disclosure, I do have a link to One Acre Fund, and I remember when we put that number, 1 billion trees, and it seemed impossible. It's incredible the work that the team has done to get so far along that and be on track to hitting that goal. Nate, I'll come to you next. At Miraterra, soil health is kind of your thing, and you also have your own you have a link to the Global South, but you're taking a look at the dynamics of soil health here and around the world. Tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing at Miraterra, the approaches you're applying, and reflect on how they might apply or might apply differently in the context of places like the kinds of places that One Acre Fund is working in.
Great. Good morning. Hi, everybody. Since it's early in the morning, I'll start with a story just to get you a little interested. I was 1 year old, and a bunch of us packed up, got on a houseboat, and went 2 weeks downriver, down the Caquetá River in Colombia to the heart of the Amazon forest. I was born in the Amazon. And then we took out our machetes and our hand saws, and we started chopping. This is how you clear land in the Amazon. You chop the biggest trees down, and those trees take down the underbrush. Then you take your machetes and you hack, and then you burn it. And that's how you clear cut the land. And then you take out your hand tools and you start tilling the soil. And what starts off as this amazingly dark, rich soil, 2 years later, it's clay, and it's almost worthless. And little did we know what we were actually doing was disrupting one of the richest, most magical ecosystems on the planet. Because what happens in the Amazon is that it's so rich in biodiversity that all nutrients are constantly being cycled in living matter. And when you destroy the living matter, you disrupt that cycle and you end up with barren soil. And 50 years later, I'm leading a company that is trying to help solve that problem. The problem of little did we know. That's the problem that we try to tackle at Miraterra. Little did we know what we were doing, and what's missing, I think, in the world, and what we believe at Miraterra in the world of soil health, is measurement and understanding and knowledge and insight. That's really what's missing. There's all these amazing things happening and wonderful people doing great inputs work and markets that are growing up. And when we looked and assessed at the measurement systems for measuring soil, we found them woefully deficient. And it's no knock on the folks that measure soil, like they're doing fantastic work, but it's the one area where it feels like technology has not in any way disrupted or influenced. I've spent more than 20 years in technology. I used to work in Silicon Valley. I've been in every imaginable technology that you can think of. I've been very fortunate to be part of them all. And the one area where that technology is not yet kind of having an effect is in soil measurement. So at Miraterra, we take some of the greatest technology on the planet, from lasers to signal processing, machine learning, AI, as everybody says nowadays, AI, and we use it to change measurement. And we do that by measuring soil in a completely new way, using some very modern technologies. And then we try to find the connecting threads between soil and plants and feed and food and health, and do it in a way that's very cheap, is very cost effective, is very quick, it's very efficient. And our goal, a dream of mine, and this is a very personal dream of mine, is to be able to package this technology and actually take it directly to the parts of the world where it can be the most useful. And we can, because for our instruments, all you need is internet and electricity and soil, and you can, and it works. So yeah, that's what we're working on at Miraterra. Super excited. We've been at this not quite 2 years yet. We're deploying our products right now in the world, and excited to hopefully soon package them up and bring them to the global south.
Fantastic. The image of you, 1 year old, wielding a machete is one I couldn't get out of my mind from the description.
I was three when
you were three with a machete wielding 3-year-old Nate. That's an image for all of you to take away if you can hear anything else beyond that image, that'll be great. Joyce, you spend a lot of time actually working with farmers at Safi Organics. You're delivering fertilizer. You're delivering a solution, and you're manufacturing it on site. Speak a little bit to that journey of actually kind of producing and distributing a product that's directly contributing to soil health. What's working, what's not working in that context?
So thank you, everyone, and thanks for having me. So over the last 9 years, Safi Organics has been committed to changing the narrative of soils in Africa getting degraded. No matter how much fertilizer we keep applying to the soils, we keep still having declined yields. So the idea was birthed in 2015 to change that narrative. Myself, I'm a child of a farmer. I'm a farmer today. So I've lived the experience of challenges of farming. And that's why I feel Safi Organics is at the center to contribute to this change. So we use a decentralized fertilizer production pyrolysis machine located in the rural areas of Kenya to actually convert available biomass waste, such as rice husk, and still exploring other biomass waste, such as coffee husk, macadamia husk, but guys, name it, we can convert that into biochar. So biochar might be a relatively new term to some of you, but it's just a substrate that can actually change the whole aspect. It's just one of the solutions when you talk about regenerative agriculture and the power that it has. So this is a solution we developed, and short story to actually tell you that initially in 2016, when we launched our product in the market, farmers were actually using 20 bags of our biochar to apply in 1 acre. And of course, the feedback was, it's labor intensive, it's costly, and our team is really committed to ensure that our farmers are comfortable. Farmers are very vulnerable. Supply of fake fertilizers, pesticides, name it. They have really been at that center where they feel like they're really tired and cheated. So making this solution closer to them and actually making it more affordable in comparison with the imported synthetic fertilizers they are actually unable to actually afford is mind-blowing. And that's what keeps me really encouraged to work on this space. So we have been able to sequester over 40,000 tons of biomass and looking to do more, and also sequestered over 30,000 tons of CO2 from the environment. Biochar having the capacity and the potential to actually contribute to removing global emissions, say, for example, 6%. James might be having better numbers, but 6% of global emissions, which is actually translating to about 3 billion tons of CO2 annually, and that is equivalent to actually 803 coal plants emissions globally. So I feel that we are strategically positioned to actually change that and empower the lives of smallholder farmers, but just supplying farm inputs that are really at the local solutions. So we are just scaling that and actually working with youth groups. I would say that our biggest strength and the resources that we have in Safi Organics is the partnership working with the youth groups. So one of our priorities is machine has been deployed in a youth group, which is creating direct employment to about 10 youths. We are talking about jobs. Safi Organics is not really talking about jobs. We are talking about quality and sustainable jobs in the rural areas. So for that reason, we are scaling that and trying to see how can we franchise our model to other rural areas across the country and in Africa across the board. So I think we are in the right trajectory and really trying to change the narrative in the region agricultural space.
Thank you, Joyce. It's you know, the thing I love about the story of Safi is you're taking waste biomass in a locale, using young people in the locale to gather and help process it, adding nutrients to it, and then putting it right back on the soil and using it to drive yield. And in the process, you're durably removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere because biochar is counted as a durable carbon removal. It almost sounds too good to be true. And so the first time I looked at what you guys were doing, I assumed surely this has to be working less well on the field than the traditional model that we use of imported chemical fertilizer. Is that the case?
Truth be told, is that we have done impact measurement of the use of our fertilizers to across more than 15,000 smallholder farmers that we are partnering with. So at least averagely, we give a guarantee to farmers that you have a 30% increase in yields using the same amount that you would spend in buying synthetic fertilizers. However, we are comparing that with the fertilizers that are government subsidized. But our fertilizer is not subsidized. So what that means is that getting to the space of carbon credit will actually bring in another source of revenue for Safi Organics to be in a position to subsidize our fertilizers. Because you know, we have recurring cost of production that are keeping going up now and then, and looks like things are not stabilizing soon. So we need to really get our hands out there, become innovative, and get this as another source of revenue. And also, atop on that is that For example, let me give a case scenario of our first farmer. His name is Mr. Dan. And why I said that 30% is an average of the farmers that we are working with. But this particular farmer actually had an increase of 100% increase in yields by using our fertilizer. So he was so happy that he did not believe that that's a fertilizer. And he was like, can you guys come over for Christmas? And I tell you that it was 2016. I think it's a story that my co-founder and the team we began with will always refer to that story, because that is the kind of impact Safi Organics is committed to drive across smallholder farmers in Africa.
Yeah. So I like this idea of talking about the positive impact of this. And I think if there's a point I want to leave with the audience to take away, is because particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, smallholders are so poorly served by the existing agricultural system, you can actually find immediate gains from pivoting to regenerative agriculture, in addition to the long-term gains. You're not dealing with a finely tuned industrial farming system, in a sense. Carolyn, you spend a lot of time thinking about the ins and outs of the economics of transitioning to an approach that has healthy soils at its core. How are you thinking about or seeing the cost benefit of the various interventions? There's a big agroforestry program, but I know we're looking at, and I'll say we are looking at a wider range of interventions. Are you seeing similar dynamics in terms of the cost benefit? Is it a bit more complicated for some interventions versus others?
Yeah, that's a great question. I can speak, well, we're on an agroforestry topic too. I can speak a little bit about, to tie into carbon as well, just some of the pilots that we've been doing to work carbon markets in as a potential source of funding as well. I think trees are really where we see carbon financing having a potential, but that doesn't mean it's without challenges, especially to roll out at the kind of scale, given the number of farmers that we serve. So outside of our tree planting initiative, the 1 billion tree planting initiative, we have several high-touch carbon pilots that are designed to promote permanent tree planting and adhere to carbon market standards. So we designed these programs to adhere to carbon market standards in order to eventually receive carbon credits and share those with farmers. So right now we have 3 intensive agroforestry pilots in Zambia, Malawi, and Tanzania, and we have 1 landscape restoration pilot, and that's in Rwanda. We served 7,000 farmers in 2023 and project to serve 24,000 farmers in 2024 through these pilots, these really high-touch pilots. And we provide farmers incentives for keeping trees in the ground and keeping trees alive to be compliant with carbon markets. But the international standards for certifying emission reductions are really they weren't designed to be inclusive for smallholder farmers. So some of the challenges we see in making this kind of cost-benefit work is that the pilots we've designed to address these challenges, but their challenges to scale would be enrollment, so proof of land tenure, permanence, so keeping trees in the ground and kind of the more expensive species to keep trees in the ground. Monitoring, reporting, and verification, just to make it cost effective to actually count trees. We have done some trials and looked into different types of remote sensing technologies, which are really interesting, but currently, the cost benefit and being the tech to serve the regions that we work in is something that I think there's still a gap there. And then the financing. So my role at 1 Acre Fund, I raise working capital for the organization. That can be tricky. I think carbon financing can be even more complex. And so those are just some of the challenges to scale there. But I think there are so many interesting technologies out there, and whether it's biochar or clean cook stoves and market actors that could potentially get these products certified. And then if we were to report back data, there could be a really win-win situation situation there where carbon can step in and really finance some of these products.
So, Carolyn, as you were speaking and talking about the verification burden and the rules around that, and Joyce also talked about subsidies on the bad stuff or the less good stuff. I reflected back on our conversation a week ago, and I know, Nate, you are very passionate about how upside down our whole system and our whole approach is. Who gets to carry the burden of proof, and where, what we choose to subsidize and penalize. Say a little bit more about that. What are we getting wrong in terms of driving this transition and this shift to solutions that should work, but aren't necessarily working as well as they should?
Yeah, it's interesting. It is an area that we spend a lot of time thinking about, because there's a burden that falls on farmers, I think, unfairly. One is the burden of they get blamed for a lot of the practices that are releasing carbon or causing erosion, when that's not their fault. It's not their fault that all this is happening. We have to feed our planet. And so we see it as lack of insight and lack of knowledge that is not available to them. The second burden that they carry is there's these markets that are available that I'm sure on paper look really good, where you get $20 an acre or something like that. But then when you actually take the burden of proof and put it on the farmer, it's much more expensive than the money that they're going to get from the programs. And that's not right either, right? Because if you think about, if you want to verify, let's say, carbon sequestration, or if you want to verify, let's say, sustainable fuel, you have to go through a process of sampling that's very expensive. You have to hire an agronomist. This is in North America, but I imagine it's not much different in the global South. You have to sample, you have to pull soil out of the ground, you have to ship it. You have to send it to labs where they do a lot of chemical treatment and processing. That's very expensive. So maybe it costs you, I don't know, $100, $200 a sample to just get the evidence that the practices that you're doing are helping to heal the soil. And so the burden of both the responsibility and the blame oftentimes gets passed on to the farmer, and then also the burden of verifying in order for them to get the credits that are available to them. And that just feels wrong. So, I said on the call, if I could encourage anybody to invest in transforming just a measurement solution for all of this, because the burden shouldn't fall on them. I would love for the world to come together and just come up with a simple way to verify practice and verify what's happening with the soil, so that that burden gets removed out of the equation, so that they can truly harvest the credits that are available to them, that is there for the practices that they've adopted, and take away the cognitive burden, the technical burden, the cost burden of the verification today that falls onto the farmer. And that's what we're trying to do at Meriterra, not to toot our own horn, but we use satellites and we use spectroscopy and other technology to transform that solution so that we can measure quickly and cheaply. And I just want to raise the lack of awareness around measurement, because I think in almost every program, whether it's regenerative, practice verification, carbon markets verification, sustainable fuels verification, even precision agriculture, which is about smart application of inputs, all of that requires measurement. It requires verification. And that platform of measurement is missing. And the last thing I'll say about this is the standards that are developed on a lot of this verification were put in place 30, 40 years ago. And how do those standards still apply today when the entire industry has changed around the credits, but the standards that they're still being forced to adopt were thought of 40, 50 years ago, before technology had a role to play? So I think we need to update the standards, and I think we need to, if I had a dream, I would have a unified measurement and verification platform that everybody could use and take that burden off of the farmers. Yeah.
So it's interesting, as you were speaking, a question came in that seems designed to just follow on to where you are. So I'll go with that question, and please keep them coming as the conversation goes on. Which is, all right, the standards are 50 years old, they're outdated, they've got a whole bunch of metrics that are difficult to gather, expensive to collate, et cetera, et cetera. How do you change? What are the metrics that really matter? We don't want to just kind of wave our hands and say, we'll not measure anything. If we gave you the magic wand, what are we measuring? How are we measuring it?
Well, that's a great question, whoever asked that. Yeah, it's interesting today in the world of measurement and verification, there's kind of two camps. There's the soil camp that says we need to increase the rigor of our testing because there's not enough data in order to get rigorous models, and that's expensive. There's another side that is saying, oh no, modeling, machine learning is going to solve it all, and so we can just solve it with better models. I actually think it's the marrying of the two of them that's the answer. We need to increase the rigor of our testing, and we need to improve the models that we're using to actually predict outcomes. And so rather than specifying a specific thing we should measure, because I think it might be a bit dangerous to put one thing over another. Like pH is something that's very important, but organic matter or carbon might be important for a different application. So rather than saying one thing is more important than the other, I'd say that the platform, the system for measurement, can get to some of these critical measurements quicker and better with some of the technology that exists in the world. There's great technology out there, not just with us, but with others, that if we think about this fresh, so I ran into this problem just this week where we have a soil testing lab, which is where we bring our equipment, who is getting great results from our instrument. But the verification body that sent them the samples is requiring a methodology for testing that is about 60 years old. And so they're saying, I have the answer and I got it in 7 minutes from your product. I can't use that because the methodology that was required when the samples were sent to me requires an acidic compote that is so deadly that if people were to have it released while they're in the room would really affect their health. And so, I think it's less about the specific thing that you're measuring, because there's probably about 13 different attributes of soil that are very important, but it's about changing the system of measurement so that we don't have some of these archaic standards that are being required when there's new technology that can help bring that knowledge very quickly to the forefront.
Yeah. I think that point bears emphasis that, getting to clear and straightforward ways of measuring is critical to showing the potential and telling the story. Maybe one thing I'll interject with is my colleagues at CAP-A, the Climate Action Platform Africa, working with the Cash Coalition, among others, were looking at this whole question of, well, what happens when you combine a set of otherwise disparate things like solar irrigation to avoid emissions? That's not regenerative. A soil health intervention like enhanced rock weathering to manage pH, but at the same time remove carbon. Application of fertilizer, organic fertilizer like biochar, and agroforestry. And the interesting thing is, in theory, each of these things is valuable on its own. When you layer them together, 1 + 1 + 1 is equal to 9 or 10. And what you're doing is you're both avoiding emissions on some dimensions, you're removing carbon on other dimensions, and you're boosting soil organic carbon across the whole system by all of this. So there is this real opportunity here, but because we are not figuring out a way to incentivize each of these things properly, we don't get to start baking the cake. It's overly granular. I'm looking at these questions, and I think I'll come to you, Joyce, because there's a question here about how does regenerative agriculture or interventions that really focus on soil health, let's say that, how do they reduce the risks of lower or more volatile crop yields? I know that you have a perspective on what are the almost trailing benefits of your product in the soil and other interventions like that in the soil. Maybe speak a little bit to that.
Talking about the impact, probably in biochar, because that's what I'm best do every day. It has a range of benefits to the soil. Number one, in its natural nature, it's able to reduce soil acidity, which is the huge menace in Africa, having over 56% of our soils being acidic. So for that reason, it's bridging that gap. And then when we talk about organic matter, most of our farmers initially would actually bury back their crop waste into the farm. Right now, they're actually selling everything and leaving the soil bare. That means that even though we talk about soil health, we cannot talk about yield productivity if we have not talked about soil health at first. So we are giving the farmers an opportunity to still get another source of revenue, but then we collect the waste and then turn it into fertilizer, and they can still use it in their own farms. So it's actually embracing and beefing up the organic matter in the soils. Hence, we talk about soil fertility. So that will directly now go to increase in yields. And of course, enabling these farmers to use their other income in other creative activities and develop their own lives. So it's not all about environmental impacts. It's not all about economical impact. It's a whole range, a systematic approach that is actually covering around all these aspects. However, despite us having carbon revenue, I still feel and strongly feel that is the right thing to do so that we can sustainably and in a very good platform make these farmers actually have the best from their farms, because that is their day-to-day job and they're not going anywhere. And also making this attractive to the youths, because if it's profitable, if it's increasing yields, if it's actually increasing the organic matter, that directly transitions to yields and more income. Yeah.
Another thing that's striking to me is, from an adaptation and resilience perspective, what increasing soil organic matter and biochar as well in its own right does to soil water retention. And when you're dealing with the risk of drought and so on, you do see this as an additional benefit.
Yes, that's true. So biochar in its natural form is actually able to retain moisture 7 times more its weight. So what that means for fragile markets such as the recovering market in Africa, which we experience a lot of drought, is coming to bridge that gap and ensuring at least, even though there's a drought, the farmers who are actually using biochar are actually still able to harvest more than the farmers who did not use biochar. So that what keeps, like we're using referrals to ensure that more farmers are adopting our products and also regenerative practices, because they go hand in hand. Yeah.
So it's almost like a trade-off between treating the soil as a nutrient conveyor belt, where you bring the nutrients in bags, treat the soil as inert clay, take the nutrients off with the crops, and then start again from zero, which is what we tend to force agricultural systems around the world to actually treating it as a living system, which you kind of keep as a closed loop. It's almost a no-brainer. And Caroline, it almost begs a question, and I know 1 Acre Fund plays a big role in getting farmers access to fertilizer. And there's been a big push among multiple African countries to increase access to fertilizer using subsidy schemes and so on. And it begs the question, is this the right path? What's pushing us down this path? And also, what are some of the unintended consequences you're seeing from some of these fertilizer schemes? I know that you struggled within 1 Acre Fund with the impacts of some of these schemes. Maybe speak a bit to how they're designed, what's driving them, and what might we do to change them?
Sure. So speaking a little bit about like the fertilizer subsidies and so and just kind of the future of fertilizer. I guess what it makes me think of is, and I think 1 Acre Fund is looking to this and looking to the future of really what is the future of farming and what is going to work best for smallholder farmers and really reach the extreme poor farmers. So something that we do is we want to make sure that anything we roll out is really evidence-based in our specific context and economically viable for smallholder farmers. So we do work with chemical fertilizer right now, but we have other trials and we're working on other, so 1 Acre Fund has an R&D function where we try many different things related to regenerative ag, conservation agriculture, kind of focused on the outcomes first versus the practices themselves. And we put everything through a multi-phased trials. So the first phase kind of being the desk research, the like market scans, surveys, lit reviews, to kind of whittle down to what are the types of things that might be economically viable and evidence-based for our context for the farmers that we serve. And then we start rolling out the kind of best ideas that rise to the top through research station trials. These are controlled with agronomist teams, kind of trialing these things. They may include biochar. They may include lots of other types of conservation agriculture, whether it's no-till or minimal till. Oh gosh, there's many that are ongoing, but we run these in our research stations to get an idea of how they work in the context. But these are, like I said, agronomist controlled. So the next phase is really trialing these with farmers, usually a few hundred farmers to start, and making this completely risk-free for farmers. So completely free, and also like 1 acre fund will pay you back if you have lower yields or there's a differential there. And then next would be rolling it out to an even wider trial of multiple districts. And this all comes before we would kind of scale to our full farmer networks. We've run 840 trials since 2012. And just to kind of bring back to our conversation here, like some of the ones that we're trialing right now are related to cover crops, related to biochar, other fertilizer alternatives, and other types of conservation ag, so like crop rotation, minimal till, intercropping, those sorts of things.
One of the things that's been striking in that journey is, and again, there's been laudable attempts to lower the cost of fertilizer, is the fact that as governments are subsidizing, A, they're only subsidizing one type of fertilizer, and B, and this I think speaks to part of the question that was being asked, is very often it's very channel linked, and there's a lot of almost regulatory capture. So I remember 1 Acre Fund having a problem accessing fertilizer to sell through our stores at a time when farmers were lacking. You know, you've created a subsidy, but you've also limited supply. So there's an unintended consequence of trying to deliver a benefit from the state to farmers, is you're actually reducing the amount of fertilizer that's available, and also you're picking a particular approach to fertilizer, which I think is tricky. There was a question here about how much time does it take to work with a farmer to transform their farm or really adopt regenerative agricultural practices. And I was in a conversation yesterday that was really helpful for thinking about this. And Nate, I want to turn to you because you're gathering data and so on, so you may have a view on this. But it's almost like you can think of this as fairly modular. There's a lot of practices that are good for soil health. You want to adopt them all, and you want to get the yield benefit. But how are you seeing, to the extent that you're tracking it anywhere in the world, what's the rate of adoption and the lag between adoption and benefit?
I'll just say up front, I'm not an expert in this area, so I'm going to make observations on folks that we're talking to, but there are other folks that are working directly with the regenerative programs. But when I speak to them, their practices, you mentioned some of the practices already that they can adopt quickly, and I think these are just kind of like common sense practices, keeping roots in the ground, multi-cropping, you mentioned that already, cover cropping, residue absorption back into the ground. These are just common sense practices. It's kind of funny that we call it regenerative, but they're actually indigenous practices that were in place way before we took them away and then now call them regenerative. But these practices that people have always done to their land, we find that they start, restoring organic matter into the soil. And so what I hear through talking to a lot of my colleagues is that it's a 3 to 5 year journey. Another thing you can do is change the inputs. So if you're putting a lot of destructive chemicals as inputs for disease or pest, those chemicals are actually having a counter effect where they're destroying the microorganisms that are in the soil that would help the soil get healthier. I don't know if anybody knows, anybody guess what percentage of living matter, living organisms live in soil on our planet? It's about 65% of all living creatures live in soil. And so when you're doing anything to disrupt that, you're taking what I did in the Amazon, and I didn't do because I was one, but when my dad did, multiplying it times 1,000,000 because of the richness of the ecosystem that's in the soil. And so I think what I hear is that it takes 3 to 5 years, during which time there's a lot of concern about profitability and being able to survive in a very margin-tight environment. So there's a lot of programs out there, at least in North America, that help finance that transition from conventional to regenerative. That's been my observation.
Something interesting about that is, as there's growing consensus about the need to start focusing on soil health, you are starting to see some of the folks who you'd be surprised to see in a room like this, like the big kind of food system conglomerates and so on, starting to take an interest and so on. What can they do, and are you seeing them do it? Things like preferential procurement for regeneratively farmed produce, and does that make a difference in any way?
Just real quick, I'll tell 2 stories which were told to me, so these are secondhand, but largest yogurt producer in the world was saying that they moved their cattle from one farm to another where the cattle were being fed regenerative grains, and they saw a yield increase in the milk production of the cows. Completely surprised the farmers and surprised them. So there are things that are just happening. Nature is so smart, and I think we forget that. I was talking to a huge food producer in Brazil, and they were saying that after you all remember this thing called COVID and the supply chains of the world falling apart. And then in Brazil specifically, there were a lot of floods and fires. And this food producer said to me that the farmers that always delivered food consistently were the ones that were using, they call smart land practices to grow their food. The ones that were not showing up with their food. The ones that were using smart land practices were actually consistently delivering. So what we're seeing from the big corporates is that they're recognizing that smarter management of soil, smarter practices actually end up with helping them financially because they're getting their food more consistently, or they're getting higher yields, or in the case of the dairy farmer, actually getting more yield from the same cows using a different regeneratively grown feed that is more nutrient rich. So I think those are just a couple examples where people are seeing that it isn't just good for planet, it's also good for the bottom line as well.
So if I tie back to our kind of inciting question, right? Is this focus on regeneration and climate smart soils a pipe dream, only glitter, a nice story for us to feel good about over here, or real gold? It sounds like certainly in the spaces where you're seeing data, you are seeing with a 3 to 5 year lag, there's real value at a minimum. And in addition, you're seeing unanticipated and hard to predetermine additional benefits in the quality of whether it's milk production. I've heard others talk about taste and flavor. It turns out that just treating the soil as a chemical conveyor belt has an impact on the taste and flavor of the food we eat. So that's interesting, and that probably suggests that it's real gold, but you have to work at it. There was a question here, and it was actually addressed to you, Joyce, that says, how does that scale, not up, but in a way down? And we'll come to the 1 Acre Fund view on this, but how does it scale down to small farmers in disparate locations, right? I'll read it as it was. So can you share if these innovative interventions could work in geographies where scale is difficult or impossible, such as, does biochar work where scale is difficult or impossible? And I think the assumption embedded in here is that smallholders will have a harder time adopting these practices than larger scale farmers. Is that true?
What I would say, and I'll give a case scenario of how Safi Organics actually started. We were initially using artisanal kilns because our project have been developed from the lab. So we have worked throughout from the lab, conception, all the way to where we are today. And that's the same thing with the smallholder farmers. And we don't need to deploy very high technical machines for a global corporation, but I think it's more scaling down to local insights and things that they can actually relate to. And to really actually encourage, and actually what is happening on the ground is that all these local solutions are more affordable than what is already that people are projecting or actually saying it's supposed to work and it's working in other areas. But then we have local solutions and local products that actually can be scaled to these smallholder farmers. Apparently, also these smallholder farmers are also very receptive to information and to try, because largest of our smallholder farmers are kind of old folks. So they have seen it, they are tired of seeing the decline in yields and all these climate change issues. So they're really desperate to look, that's for knowledge, that's for local solutions, and they have already been like, they've been getting important products and all that. So they seem they're in a good space where they want to try what is working, and actually they want to feel. So if you're doing demonstration plots and if you're getting the product to these smallholder farmers, they want to hear the story, they want to see and touch. So you need to do, of course, demonstrations. So we have a few funding coming in just to ensure that these farmers are trained and they understand. And they also want to be part of the process. You don't just want to bring a product from, from the global north, from another country, and try to push it to these farmers. They want to be part of the process during the product development. So that would be my view of how they are able to actually bring in and adopt products, because they also feel that they were part of that process. And it's always said that if people actually contributed to the solution and they were also part of the problem, they would feel inclined to solve that.
Talking agroforestry, I mean, the journey from a standing start to 250 million, how was that affected by the fact, a lot of this was happening in places like Rwanda and Kenya, and often in tricky geographies, hilly plots and so on. To what extent was that a hindrance or an aid, do you think? Are you finding that adoption is hindered by the scale of the, it is 1 acre fund, right? Is there a drag there, or are these actually farmers who already see the immediate value of the trees and so on? Are you pushing this thing on them, or are they pulling it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was just in Rwanda visiting a tree nursery, and so it was a great opportunity to just get firsthand, just kind of casual conversation of 1 Acre Fund staff saying, wow, it's so amazing to see this so large. I remember just a few years ago when we were trying to convince farmers, look, come see the trees, take one home, see what you think, and now the demand has so grown. So I think really leading with the community-led approach, every farmer that enrolls with 1 Acre Fund has a direct contact with a field officer with, like you're saying, plots that they can come see and test things out and see the development of. And then over, a matter of not that many years, I think we really saw the demand for trees be now farmer-driven, which has allowed for scale.
So I guess the message there is this scales both up and down, right? So there's a case for large-scale producers, the folks supplying the world's biggest yogurt producer. I was tempted to say their name, but I think let's not do the brand promotions. At that scale, there's a clear signal, but actually, at the lowest scale, smallholder farmers are the least removed from some of these historical and traditional practices, and maybe the place where you can get very rapid adoption, because again, they're very poorly served by the current alternative. Is a reflection to the audience there, or to the discussants here. There's a question I'd been meaning to just roll into the middle of the room a little bit, which is, we've touched on it in a number of ways, carbon and carbon markets. Hard to access. There has been a tough period over the last it's been a hard time to be talking about particularly voluntary carbon as a way to accomplish some of this work. In each of your work, how are you thinking about it, right? And I know that there's a view that says we're not going to carbon trade our way to saving the planet, but is it important? How does it work? What does it do in the respective models in achieving this?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. So for us in Safi Organics, and how we actually view this is an opportunity that we are really ready to tap into. Number one, because as I mentioned earlier, it's going to contribute to actually lowering down our cost of production, and that means making the biochar fertilizer really affordable to the smallholder farmers who are our target market. And the other thing, when we look into the carbon credit space, we are really creating jobs for the local youths that we work with. So by deploying our machines to the local youths, for example, saying one local youth group is actually using our machine, they can actually own the machine within the next 3 years. And that means that we are leveraging on creating other business model within the continent. So that means there's increase in income, sustainable jobs, and of course, quality jobs. So this is how we are looking at it, just to ensure that we make it and make agriculture more attractive to the local youths to actually adopt it and actually participate and contribute their quota to economic development.
Yeah, part of the way that I've seen it put is that the carbon funding is the icing on the cake. It's really important icing. It makes the cake really good. But the cake, the actual underlying cake, is a sustained boost in yields. And you can't lose sight of that. You can't be doing this stuff and there's a lot of kind of carbon chasers out there that are just about that piece of it, but you actually need to think about the full mix, and you think about the core benefit that you're driving in terms of livelihoods and so on, just as much as measuring tons in whichever way. Maybe I'll pause here because I know that we're running short of time, and I'll kind of in reverse order from where we started, and I'll start with you, Nate. Invite you each to make a little bit of a call to action or a reflection on where are we in this battle to turn our soil, make soil health a frontier of both climate action and just broader shifts in our food system. What would you like to see? What is possible? What can the folks in this conversation here do in their lives and their work?
Yeah, I'll state that I think financing regeneration is real gold, but it takes patience, and it takes thinking about investing in system change, which is important. A lot of startups are trying to finance, the boards or the investors are wanting for a quick turn, and they want them to do a single thing, a single application. But what we need is a system level change across the entire, in our world measurement, for example. And so be patient. Please invest in nature. I think nature is by far the best way to get to carbon sequestration, the best way to get to better yields. Invest in nature. And be patient and invest in system-level changes rather than just trying to do simple, single-use applications. I had a farmer say to me, I'm tired of having to manage 30 different apps, 30 different platforms, 30 different technologies. Come up with a system-level change. We need it. We all want it.
Callan?
Sure, yeah. I think I'm still kind of thinking on the carbon question too, and your emphasis that it can be the icing on the cake. I think, One Acre Fund is kind of like a giant blended finance organization, device. And so being here at SOCAP, it just kind of has me thinking of, I guess my call to action is to just think about where in that blend you can fit in. So, we do rely on philanthropy. We also have loans. Carbon finance might be a piece of this too. And just trying to kind of match the right capital in that blend to really reach the smallest scale farmers. I think that blend and that piece is really important.
Mine, I'll just say and write on the point about patience. How did we get there? And why are we talking about this? Just taken decades for us to get where we are. So it's not going to change within today. It's not going to be a press, like you just press a button and things just, magically change. But we need to collectively work together from a global platform, from local insights, and speak the language that the farmers and the people who are in dire need of that will understand. So why can't we not just do, the bottom-top approach? I think that's what will actually work together and collectively, partner and not be, competing but complementing each other.
Thank you. It strikes me that embedded in that is this huge opportunity, and maybe the opportunity I hope all of you will take away. The largest group of people on Earth, the largest single category of livelihoods on the planet is farmers, the stewards of the land. That's what a good chunk of humanity still does. If we get this right, we turn them back to being proper stewards of the land rather than exploiters of the land. And we put them at the front lines, not just of surviving and subsisting in the context of climate change, but really at the frontier of pushing back against it and bringing us back within planetary bounds and into a healthy and inclusive food system. I can't think of a more worthy goal, and I can't think of a more opportune moment to really sign on to the battle for global soil health.